There seems to be no statement that I say in my sermons that gets more pushback than my belief that things are getting better. So I thought I'd preach on it. And I believe this both on empirical grounds that we can measure here in the real world, and I also have a spiritual outlook I'd like to share as well of why I think things are getting better, and maybe it make you feel a little bit better about things. Now, let me start by acknowledging that I know that my viewpoint is not a majority view. One survey said that only 6% of Americans feel things are getting better, and you can understand why. Climate change, we're told, is likely to end life on Earth as we know it. Our political system has descended into an us versus them performance battle with little ability to get things done. Racism and anti-Semitism seem to be on the upswing. Younger people are reporting higher levels of anxiety and depression. And global relations with Russia are as dangerous as the Cold War, and our relationship with China seems to be going in a negative direction. And if World War III on the horizon is not enough, we're entering a global recession. And weekly we experience mass killings, and crime is up. And meanwhile, for those of us in the church attendance is crashing, and ministers are fleeing their pulpits. So, I know, you thought I was going to make a good case for how things are getting better. Things sound horrible, right? But I did want to acknowledge that I know where you're coming from. I live in the same world that you do, and I can see what's going on, and I acknowledge all those things. But I think when we look at some data and compare things, it's actually a lot of evidence that things are improving. One reality is that as things improve, we constantly want to see more improvement. And there are things that we're aware of today that we wouldn't even be aware of to be concerned about. Climate change is a good example. It's an important challenge for us today, but really only a few generations ago, it really would not be understood as we understand it now. And our politics is polarized. I preach a lot on that topic, but we're not killing each other in duels in the street like we did 200 years ago. And we have not yet declared all-out bloody war as we did only a little over 100 years ago in the Civil War. Racism persists, but few issues have progressed as dramatically as how we treat Black Americans. We're only 150 years away from a time when Black people were owned, tortured, and murdered. We're only 60 years away from a time when you could discriminate openly against a Black person in housing, employment, and even celebrity life. So racism persists, but progress is dramatic over the last 2 years. Anti-Semitism, which we see more anti-Semitic acts recently, but in a recent Pew survey, the religion most admired by all other religions were the Jews. And only 100 years ago, most colleges and clubs forbade Jewish membership. And younger people do have greater anxiety, I believe, but there's also a theory that from researchers that the anxiety disorders were always there but not ever reported, and it was not people were not actively seeking treatment. But I do believe that with the advent of social media and other factors that is a serious concern. Globally, we can look at Russia. They thought they could simply conquer Ukraine in a couple of days, and frankly, so did many of us. It didn't happen because democracies around the world came to their aid. Wars, which were the norm 200 years ago, are today actually rare. Now, democracy is under threat, but if you think about it, just 250 years ago, 2/3 of the world were all under monarchies or dictatorships. And China and India's shift to market economies in the 80s has created the largest lift of people out of poverty in the history of the world. Most people are eating much better. 200 years ago, 90% of the world lived in severe poverty. That's only 10% today. That's progress. In the US, the national poverty rate fell, actually, from 2009 to 2011, which is surprising because of the pandemic. And our recession is being managed to control inflation, and it still seems our economy chugs ahead. Post-pandemic, there's been a rise in gun violence, and gun violence is horrible, but when you compare it, it's largely suicides. They are actually lower than they were in the 70s. Murders by gun per 1,000 people also peaked in 1972 in the United States. Active shooters, which we see a lot more of, have definitely dramatically increased, and that's a relatively new phenomena, and one that we see a lot of and obviously concerns us. Medically, My goodness, all the new treatments we have, if you've had a joint repaired or you've fought disease, it's been incredible what medicine has done. Last week, I told you I had my kidney stone experience in an emergency room, and I can tell you I was relieved that there was modern science and there was really good drugs to get me through it. And I don't know anybody who says, take me back to the 1800s for medicine again, the good old days. And life expectancy, which is probably one of the best measures of progress, has been getting better. 300 years ago, the average life expectancy was 30 years old. Today it's 70, and in the United States it's 80. And then if you look at women's rights, dramatically changed over the last 200 years. Women now surpass men in the number of Americans getting a bachelor's degree. It wasn't long ago that women were forbidden from going to school. Gay and lesbian rights might be the most dramatic. In my own lifetime, gay men, a couple, 10 or 15 years older than me, suffered shock treatments when they were undergraduates at Harvard College in the 1960s and 70s to treat them for being gay. So a lot of progress on that front. So I think there is a strong argument, just based on a lot of data, that things are getting better. Now, if things are getting better, why do we feel so bad? I think each generation is nostalgic for our good old days when things were better. I think that drives a lot of our political movements right now. Make America Great, looking back to when we were a better country. But I also think that with our media, it covers crises, and it doesn't cover good news. And you've heard the expression, if it bleeds, it leads. So we get lots of negative information every day, and it reinforces our fears and negative stories. And the more we advance, the more we see what needs to be fixed. So the battle for social justice keeps rolling. We keep seeing what needs to be done. So on all those factual grounds, I think things are getting better. That's my belief. You could certainly argue that, and I know, again, most people don't agree with that. But I'd also like to speak, we are a church, and this is a spiritual community, and we have some interesting teachings. I did want to talk about my belief that there's a spiritual evolution going on in the world, too. And this actually gives me more solace than any of the economic data. I believe we're in the midst of a spiritual evolution that's in God's hands, and we have a role to play in it. And this idea of evolution, that things are evolving, we generally associate that idea that things are evolving with Charles Darwin's book in 1859, The Origin of Species, and he made a case about evolution, became quite controversial within the faith community. The reality is the ancient Greek philosopher Anaximander, in the 6th century BCE, wrote a theory of evolution that just kind of blows my mind. He said that he believed that the warmed up water on the earth emerged fish-like people and animals that eventually evolved into human beings. That was 5 centuries before the Common Era. Wow. So the idea that we've been evolving has been evolving throughout history. The Chinese Taoist philosopher Zheng Xiao in the 3rd century expressed an idea that the heavens were involved in a constant transformation of the species on Earth and had an evolutionary model. And even in the Christian church, we tend to think that the Christian church is in opposition to evolution and the concept of evolution, but Augustine, St. Augustine, 4th century, very famous Christian theologian, leader, author, one of the greats, he actually described a spiritual evolution of the world based on the Bible. And he had 6 ages, and he talked about the Adam age, the Noah age, the Abraham age, the David age, the Jesus age. And so it's really one of the first, what you call a spiritual evolution theory based on Scripture. And that had continued throughout the early Christian church. A lot of the early Christian fathers wrote examples where they believed that there was an evolution taking place both physically and spiritually. And they dismissed any interpretation of the story of Genesis as a literal story. They saw it as allegory. This is also true in the Muslim world. Ibn Khaldun, if I pronounced that wrong properly, probably, but he's often seen as the father of social sciences. And he described an evolution, a spiritual evolution, and even said, I think the world evolved from the monkeys in 1377. So this idea that things are evolving and there's a spiritual connection to it has been going on for a long time. Now, we kind of think of it as a split. You're either in favor of evolution or you're in favor of the Bible. That split took place during the Enlightenment, and the early people who talked about evolution all had a spiritual connection to it. But eventually that did break, and so a secular culture arose that didn't see God involved in evolution. It was just a mutation, and there were these other folks who saw it as a spiritual connection. And into that moment comes Swedenborg, who is both a scientist and very knowledgeable in the areas of plants and the anatomy. But he also had this mystical vision, and that was that he believed that the text today from Daniel was describing various spiritual ages that humanity has gone through and would go through. And it's not that far really from Augustine's, but he said that if you remember in that story, it described different, stones, bronze, copper, iron, gold, and so forth. So he describes these as different ages, and I find this completely fascinating. So maybe you do, maybe you don't, but he describes that King Nebuchadnezzar has this dream. He's so frustrated, he says he's going to kill all the wise men in his kingdom. Daniel has been kidnapped from Israel and is a wise man, and he'll be killed too, because no one can interpret the dream, and he interprets it as predicting to the king different evolutions of governments that will come. And you heard that in the story. Swedenborg says these are 5 ages of spirituality, and he calls the first one the most ancient church, and that this is the period of Adam, and is marked by humanity's moving from hunter-gatherer to tilling the soil. This period is completely connected to God, maybe a golden period, but eventually gets corrupted, and that's represented by the snake in the creation story, and it's drowned out, and that's the symbol of the flood story. The next epoch that he talks about is the ancient period, and that's the Noah period. And unlike the earlier period that had a direct connection with God, this period understands God through sacred writings, and it's the period of the great empires in Egypt, Babylon, Mesoamerica, India. Around the world, these were all happening. And this period ends with the story of the Tower of Babel, the collapse of empires. And then the next evolution spiritually in the world is the Hebrew period, and that is Abraham's descendants, and we would see that in our Old Testament stories. And then the next period after that is the Christian period, related to the iron in the statue. And this period is created, they each evolve because the other one fails. And this one is that the faith had gotten too ritualistic. It lost the meaning of the importance of love. And so the Christian period was to bring that back in. Unfortunately for the Christian period, it didn't last all that long. He says that really after about 300 years, it had the divisions, and that's the clay and the iron, meaning that some Christians were still talking about the love of Christ and Jesus, and others were more into rituals, rules, and regulations. And then finally, he talks about the latest epoch. It's called the New Jerusalem period, and this happens in the late 1700s, and its story is told in Revelations through imagery. And that's when the stone becomes a mountain in the Nebuchadnezzar dream. And Swedenborg is living in that period, says there's going to be dramatic changes in governments, the way we treat people is going to be dramatically changed over this next period. And of course, shortly thereafter, we do see the end of slavery almost globally, and we see the rise of democracy almost globally. So we see big shifts. So in telling the Bible story, we see an evolving story of humanity. And I honestly find this one of the most fascinating parts of our theology, an evolving spirituality taking place in the world. And not only is this happening within our world, but it's happening within ourselves. So the whole field of developmental theory, where we talk about we each evolve in our own lives to different levels, Swedenborg spoke about the story of creation, the 7 days of creation representing 7 days of human development. And This came forward, I remember when I was in my first year of divinity school reading the works of a man named James Fowler, and he was arguing that spiritual development had these same like psychological levels of growth that we all go through. And I was just fascinated. Here was these connections to these old writings and modern psychology that we're evolving personally, spiritually, and the world is evolving. So this is where I'm optimistic, because I think there's something much bigger going on than just humanity's evolution. And the purpose of our life here is to grow and develop spiritually and move more from being solely self-interested to becoming compassionate and empathetic towards others. And this move from one epoch to another in our own life is tremendously challenging. We go through chaos where our narratives fall apart and we have to evolve to the next level. That's in spiritual language called the dark night of the soul. And there is usually a period of chaos in our lives. And that happens in cultures too. When a culture is moving from one level to another, there's a period of chaos. I think we're still in a period of chaos in the world right now as we're evolving to a higher level of spirituality in the world. So I do believe things are getting better, and the decisions that each of us make can actually make that more or less true, meaning that we are in a co-creation with God in this world, that the future is. We're told that even the angels don't know the future because it does depend on our free will. What we do can speed up justice, or it can slow justice down and make for more chaos and more crises. And so I believe for you and for me and here at Church of the Holy City, we are asked to bring in this new epoch, this new Jerusalem, this time of love and understanding, and play our role to creating more justice in the world. It does require us to be active, both in our spiritual development personally, but also in the world. And this makes me feel both responsible and burdened. We have a clear role to play in this co-creative process. The question is, will we have the awareness and the courage to step up and play our role to bring heaven to earth with God's help? Amen.